Hello, friends? Friends, in 2011, there was a boy living in Australia named Dan Saunders. He was from a town called Wangaratta. This boy worked in a restaurant and didn't have much money. Life was tough, but he had no idea how it was about to change. Friends, one night in 2011, Dan went out with his friends. It was 1 a.m. when he ran out of money and went to an ATM to withdraw some cash. His account was with the National Australia Bank. Dan had 2 cards, a debit card linked to his savings account and a credit card linked to his credit account. Dan checked the balance on his debit card and there were only $3 in his account. He then took out his credit card and thought of borrowing money from the bank. He could borrow up to $1,000 from the bank. To do this, he needed to transfer money from his credit card to his savings account. Friends, he transferred $200 from his credit card to his savings account, but the transaction was canceled. Dan was puzzled about why this happened. He checked his balance just in case the money had arrived, and it had. There were now $200 in his account, but here was the shocking part. There was no record of this transaction in Dan's credit account. Now, you might be confused. Friends, the bank had loaned Dan $200, but there was no man. The bank's records showed that Dan hadn't borrowed any money. Dan then transferred $500 from his credit card to his savings account, and this transaction also had no record. Dan transferred $2,000 in this way, even though he could only borrow $1,000. Dan was both surprised and happy. He went back home and fell asleep. The next morning, when Dan woke up, he thought he had dreamt it all, but it wasn't a dream. He checked his credit account again, and there was still no record of the $2,000 loan. The bank had loaned Dan $2,000, and the bank didn't even know it. Friends, Dan thought that maybe the National Australia Bank's ATMs went offline between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., causing this glitch. The next night, he went to the ATM at 1:30 a.m. again. He transferred money from his credit card, and again, the bank loaned him money with no record of the transaction. Dan was shocked. He realized that this could change his life if he continued withdrawing money. However, there was a problem. Dan noticed that while he could withdraw money, the bank system would realize the mistake and reverse the transaction a day later. Dan could be caught at any time. He figured that if he transferred $1,001 night, he should transfer more the next night, so that even if the bank reversed the transaction, there would still be money in his account. This was quite confusing, but Dan took full advantage of the mistake. Friends, in just 4 months, Dan had spent 1.6 million Australian dollars from the bank. He bought a luxurious car, expensive clothes, and went on vacations. Dan's life changed in those 4 months. He even started giving money to his friends and paying for their education. Some of his friends knew about this story, and some tried to stop him, but Dan wasn't going to stop. Dan didn't tell his family because he knew it was wrong. He knew his parents would stop him and immediately inform the bank. 4 months later, Dan went to the bank a bit worried that he might get caught. He wanted to check if everything was okay, but the bank had no idea. Even so, Dan started living in constant fear. If the doorbell rang, he thought the police were outside. He would wake up sweating at night because he knew he could be caught at any moment. Dan started having anxiety attacks. He was getting money, but it wasn't his. The fear of getting caught was ruining his life. He didn't want to be separated from his family or end up in jail. After 4 months, he stopped doing these transactions. Friends, this was in July 2011, when Dan himself called the National Australia Bank and told them the whole story. The bank employees were shocked and said that the matter would now be reported to the police. Dan was very scared. He told the bank he had only $800,000 left and they could take it back and let him go, but the bank was furious. He waited for the police to arrive, but friends, for 2 years, no police came. The bank didn't say anything to him. The truth is, the bank didn't want this case to become public because it would have severely damaged their reputation. So they didn't say anything to Dan, but Dan was still terrified. Friends, he was so troubled that he went to a psychiatrist. He felt guilty and knew he had done something very wrong. In his guilt, he went to the media himself and told his story, wanting to be punished for his mistake. Friends, Dan was sentenced to 1 year in jail. After getting out of jail, he was happy and satisfied that he had paid for his mistake.